In rural India, a 65-year-old grandmother was about to break 50 years of silence. What started as evening chores took a shocking turn when her family announced an arranged marriage for her granddaughter. Kamala Devi wasn't your typical elder. For decades, she had carried the secret of her own forced marriage at 14 to a stranger 40 years older. When she encountered her granddaughter's desperate rejection of tradition, she realized she was facing the chance to break a generational cycle. Kamala's decision to finally speak would shatter everything the family believed about love, duty, and sacrifice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The evening light filtered through the neem trees, casting long shadows across the courtyard, where Kamala sat on her worn wooden stool, watching her granddaughter with the quiet intensity of someone who had learned to read the world through careful observation. At 65, her hands bore the map of decades, calloused from work, gentle from love, steady despite the arthritis that reminded her daily of time's passage. She folded clothes with practiced efficiency, but her eyes never left Priya. 22 years old and fresh from university, Priya moved through her evening chores with the unconscious grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Her sari was pinned up practically as she swept the courtyard, humming a Bollywood song under her breath. The computer science degree hanging in her room meant nothing here in this moment. She was simply a granddaughter helping her family, her movements efficient but distracted. Kamala noticed how Priya's fingers moved constantly, as if typing on an invisible keyboard, how her eyes occasionally drifted toward the road that led to the city. "She's thinking of somewhere else," Kamala murmured to herself, recognizing the restlessness because she had once felt it too, though in a different lifetime. The sound of a motorcycle approaching broke the evening's rhythm. Anjali dismounted, her teacher's sari dusty from the ride, carrying the weight of news in her deliberately measured steps. Kamala's youngest daughter had inherited her mother's careful observation skills, but where Kamala had learned to hide her thoughts, Anjali wore her emotions like weather patterns, visible to those who knew how to read the signs. "Ma, Priya," Anjali called, settling her dupatta with hands that trembled slightly. "Come sit. We need to talk." The family gathered naturally, as they had for countless evening conversations. Priya's father emerged from the fields, her uncle from his workshop, cousins from their various tasks. This was how important news traveled in their household, not through individual conversations, but through the collective witnessing that made decisions binding. Kamala felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before life-changing announcements. She had felt it the day her own marriage was announced, the day each of her children was born, the day Raman died. Some instincts never dulled with age. "The Mehta family visited me at school today," Anjali began, her voice carrying the forced brightness of someone delivering what she believed was good news. "Dr. Vikram's mother came specifically to speak with me about Priya." Priya's head snapped up from where she had been arranging her mother's books. "Dr. Vikram?" "Their son, the one who's completed his residency in Mumbai. They've sent a formal proposal." Anjali's smile was genuine but nervous. "Priya, beta. They've asked for your hand in marriage." The evening sounds, crickets, distant temple bells, the rustle of leaves, seemed to amplify in the sudden silence. Kamala watched her granddaughter's face cycle through confusion, understanding, and then something that looked like betrayal. "Marriage?" Priya's voice was barely above a whisper. You spoke to them about marriage? Without telling me?" Anjali's expression shifted from excitement to defensive concern. "It's a good family, Priya. Dr. Vikram is educated, well-established. He has his own practice now. The family is asking for no dowry. They simply want a well-educated girl from a good family." "I don't care what they want," Priya stood abruptly, her voice rising. "I don't even know this person. You can't be serious about this." Kamala felt the familiar weight of déjà vu settle on her chest. The words were different, but the emotion, the desperate disbelief of a young woman suddenly confronted with the reality of others controlling her future, was achingly familiar. Beta, please sit. Priya's father intervened gently. At least listen to what your mother has to say. Listen to what? How you've all decided my future without me? Priya's hands were shaking now. I just graduated. I have plans. I want to work, to build a career. I'm not ready for marriage, and certainly not to some stranger. Her uncle cleared his throat. The boy is hardly a stranger, Priya. We know the family. They're respectable people. And it's not as if you have to marry tomorrow. These arrangements take time. Arrangements. Priya repeated the word like it tasted bitter. That's what I am to you? An arrangement? Kamala watched the scene unfold with the helpless recognition of history repeating itself. She saw her own young face in Priya's desperate expression, heard echoes of her own voice in her granddaughter's protests, but she also saw the differences. Priya's education, her confidence, the way she stood straight and argued rather than simply weeping in shocked silence. Nobody is forcing anything, Anjali said, though her voice carried less certainty now. We thought you'd be happy. Dr. Vikram is everything we could want for you. Educated, kind, from a good family. Everything you could want, Priya emphasized. What about what I want? And what is it that you want? Kamala's voice cut through the rising tension, quiet but carrying the authority of her years. All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of the moment, the point where she could either support the old ways or stand with her granddaughter's rebellion. Priya looked at her grandmother with a mixture of hope and desperation. I want to choose, Nani. I want to know the person I marry. I want to fall in love first, to build something real. Love. Priya's uncle shook his head. Love comes after marriage, Beta. Respect and understanding. These things grow with time. Easy words from someone who chose his own wife. Priya shot back, then immediately looked stricken at her boldness. The courtyard fell silent except for the evening breeze rustling through the curry leaf plant by the kitchen door. Kamala felt the moment stretching, saw the family looking between Priya's defiant stance and the weight of tradition that had guided their choices for generations. Perhaps, Anjali said carefully, we should give you time to think about this. The Mehta family doesn't expect an immediate answer. How much time? Priya asked, her voice hollow. A few weeks. Maybe a month. To decide whether to marry a stranger or disappoint my entire family. Kamala felt each word like a physical blow. The parallels were too exact, too painful. She remembered her own mother's gentle voice, explaining that sometimes love was a luxury families couldn't afford, that security and respect were more reliable foundations for a life than the uncertain emotions poets wrote about. Priya, her father said gently, we only want what's best for you. Then let me decide what that is. The conversation fractured after that, family members offering opinions that ranged from sympathetic to frustrated. Some sided with tradition. Others expressed quiet understanding for Priya's position. But Kamala noticed how the conclusion was always the same. The girl should be grateful for such a good match, should trust her elders' wisdom, should understand that her individual desires were secondary to family harmony. As the family began to disperse for the night, Kamala remained on her stool, watching Priya sit alone on the steps leading to the house. Her granddaughter's shoulders shook with silent tears, and Kamala felt something crack open in her chest, a place where she had locked away her own memories of being 22 and terrified and utterly powerless. Later, lying on her cot in the small room she had occupied since Raman's death, Kamala stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of 5 decades pressing down on her. The familiar ache in her joints seemed secondary to the deeper pain of watching her granddaughter face the same impossible choice that had shaped Kamala's entire life. She could remain silent, as she had for so many years. She could support the family's decision, trusting that Priya would adapt as Kamala herself had learned to do. Love could grow from respect. Partnerships could develop from obligation. She had lived proof of that truth. But she also had lived proof of what that adaptation cost. The dreams deferred until they withered, the self that had to be carefully tucked away, the years of loneliness before understanding took root. She thought of her granddaughter's bright mind, her computer science degree, the light in her eyes when she talked about the career she wanted to build. The night stretched endlessly as Kamala wrestled with a decision that felt larger than herself. Outside her window she could hear the faint sound of Priya crying, and suddenly the weight of her silence became unbearable. For the first time in 50 years, Kamala allowed herself to remember her wedding day in complete detail. The terror, the grief, the sense of standing at the edge of an abyss with no choice but to jump. She remembered the girl she had been, full of dreams and questions, and she thought about the woman she had become. Tomorrow, she decided, she would break her silence. Tomorrow she would tell Priya the truth about choice and consequence, about love and survival, about the price of accepting what others decide is best for you. Tomorrow she would trust her granddaughter with the story she had never told anyone, not even Raman, not even her own children. The story of how a 14-year-old girl learned to survive when survival meant letting go of everything she had hoped to become. As dawn approached, Kamala felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. The decision was made. The silence that had protected her for so long was finally going to end. The silence in Kamala's room felt different that night. Heavier, more deliberate, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. She lay on her narrow cot, her arthritic fingers tracing the worn cotton of her blanket, while outside her window the world settled into the familiar rhythms of rural sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Priya's face. The shock, the betrayal, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would understand. Kamala's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where a thin gold chain held the small pendant Raman had given her on their 10th wedding anniversary. It was a simple thing, unremarkable to anyone else, but it represented the moment when obligation had begun its slow transformation into something deeper. She had worn it every day since, a reminder that even in the most unlikely circumstances, understanding could bloom. But before that understanding, there had been years of darkness. The memories she had locked away began to surface like old photographs emerging in Developer Solution. First blurry, then painfully sharp. Her own wedding day, the red sari that felt like a costume for someone else's life, the moment she realized that the childhood she had taken for granted was ending forever. The taste of tears mixed with turmeric paste, the weight of jewelry that felt like shackles, the faces of relatives who smiled and blessed her while signing away her future. She remembered Raman as he had been that day, tall, weathered, his face kind but distant, looking at her with the careful assessment of a man examining livestock. Not cruel, but practical. She had been a solution to his problem, nothing more. The sound of muffled sobbing drifted through the thin walls. Priya was still awake, still crying, and Kamala felt each sob like a physical blow. How many nights had she herself cried into her pillow as a young bride, mourning dreams that would never be fulfilled? How many times had she stared at the ceiling of a stranger's house, wondering if this crushing loneliness would ever ease? Kamala sat up slowly, her joints protesting the movement. Through her small window she could see the mango grove, where she had once sought solace as a young bride, the same trees that had witnessed her tears and her gradual acceptance of a life she never chose. The grove had been her sanctuary then, the only place where she could drop the mask of dutiful wife and allow herself to grieve. Tomorrow, she decided, she would take Priya there. Tomorrow, she would break the silence that had protected her for so long. The decision brought an unexpected flood of fear. She had never told anyone the complete truth about her early marriage, not even Anjali, who had been spared the worst of tradition's weight. Some stories, Kamala had always believed, were too heavy to pass down. Some pain was meant to die with the person who carried it. But watching Priya tonight, seeing her granddaughter's terror at the prospect of an arranged marriage, Kamala realized that silence wasn't protection, it was perpetuation. By keeping her story locked away, she had allowed the family to believe that arranged marriages were always successful, that young women naturally adapted, that individual desires were selfish luxuries. She thought of her mother, Mira, dead now for 15 years, who had carried her own guilt about Kamala's marriage until her final breath. How different things might have been if women had been allowed to speak honestly about the cost of survival, about the price of adapting to circumstances they never chose. As the night deepened, Kamala allowed herself to remember more. The morning after her wedding, waking up in a stranger's house to the sound of Daddy's sharp voice listing her new duties. The way Raman's children from his first marriage had looked at her, not with hostility, but with a kind of resigned acceptance that broke her heart. They had lost one mother and been given another, whether they wanted one or not. She remembered the books she had abandoned, the dreams of teaching that had withered like unwatered plants. The village teacher who had believed in her potential, who had spoken to her mother about sending Kamala to the teachers' college in the district town. That conversation had happened 2 weeks before her engagement was announced, and Kamala had never seen the teacher again without feeling the weight of what might have been. But she also remembered the gradual changes, how Raman had slowly begun to ask her opinion about household matters, then family decisions. How she had found ways to educate herself through her stepchildren's school books, reading by lamplight after everyone slept. How the birth of her first child had awakened something fierce and protective in her heart, a love so overwhelming it had redefined her understanding of purpose. The memories weren't simple, and that complexity had always made them difficult to share. How could she explain that her marriage had been both a tragedy and a salvation? That she had found love and fulfillment within a situation that began with such profound violation of her autonomy? People wanted stories to be either happy or sad, not the complicated truth of how life actually unfolded. Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky when Kamala finally rose from her cot. Her joints were stiff from the sleepless night, but her mind felt clearer than it had in years. She moved through her morning routine with deliberate care, washing her face in the small basin, braiding her gray hair, wrapping her simple cotton sari. Each action felt weighted with significance, as if she was preparing for something far more important than an ordinary day. In the kitchen, she started the tea earlier than usual, grinding fresh ginger and cardamom with the old stone mortar that had belonged to Raman's first wife. The familiar motions were soothing, grounding her in the present while she prepared to excavate the past. When Priya emerged from her room, her eyes red with exhaustion and tears, Kamala felt her resolve strengthen. Her granddaughter looked younger than her 22 years, vulnerable in a way that reminded Kamala painfully of her own 14-year-old self. "Nani," Priya said quietly, accepting the cup of tea Kamala offered. "I'm sorry about last night. I know I was disrespectful." Kamala studied her granddaughter's face, seeing the careful control that came from a night of wrestling with impossible choices. "There's nothing to apologize for, Beta. You spoke your truth. But maybe they're right. Maybe I'm being selfish, wanting something different." The words hit Kamala like a physical blow. How many times had she told herself the same thing? How many women had learned to call their natural desires for autonomy and choice selfishness? "Come with me," Kamala said suddenly, setting down her teacup. "I want to show you something." They walked in silence toward the mango grove, the morning air still cool from the night. Priya followed without question, perhaps sensing that something significant was happening. The grove was peaceful in the early light, the trees heavy with fruit that wouldn't ripen for another month. Kamala led her granddaughter to a particular tree, old, gnarled, with roots that had broken through the earth in complex patterns. She had sat beneath this tree countless times as a young bride, crying and raging and slowly learning to find peace within circumstances she couldn't change. "Sit with me," Kamala said, settling herself against the trunk with the careful movements of someone managing chronic pain. Priya sat beside her, her expression curious and slightly concerned. "Nani, are you all right?" Kamala was quiet for a long moment, gathering the courage that had taken her 50 years to find. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft, carrying the weight of a story that had been waiting decades to be told. "I was your age when they took my childhood away," she began, and felt something inside her chest break open, not with pain but with the profound relief of finally speaking the truth. Priya's breath caught in her throat. She turned to face her grandmother fully, seeing something new in Kamala's weathered features, a vulnerability that had always been carefully hidden beneath layers of quiet strength. "What do you mean, Nani?" Priya whispered, though something in her grandmother's tone already told her the answer would change everything. Kamala's fingers worked nervously with the edge of her sari, and for a moment she looked like the young girl she had once been, uncertain, frightened, but determined to speak. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me tell you about 1973, Kamala said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reaching deep into memory. I was 14 years old, and I believed the world was full of possibilities. The mango grove around them seemed to fade as Kamala transported them both back 5 decades, to a time when she had been younger than Priya, when dreams had felt as real and achievable as the morning sun rising over their village. I lived for school in those days. Kamala continued, her eyes distant. Every morning, I would race through my chores, helping Ma with the cooking, feeding the chickens, sweeping our small courtyard, just so I could get to the village school on time. Master Ji, our teacher, said I had a gift for learning. He told my mother I could be a teacher myself one day, maybe even go to the training college in the district town. Priya leaned closer, trying to imagine her traditional grandmother as a young student with ambitions. I loved everything about learning. Kamala's voice grew warmer with the memory. The feel of chalk between my fingers when Master Ji let me help with the younger children. The way words looked on the blackboard. How numbers could solve problems like magic. I had memorized entire pages from our Hindi reader, and I was teaching myself English from an old book someone had donated to the school. You wanted to be a teacher? Priya asked softly. I dreamed of it every night. I imagined myself standing in front of a classroom wearing a clean sari, helping children discover the joy of reading. Master Ji said that educated women were the future of our country, that we could help lift our villages out of poverty through knowledge. Kamala's smile was bittersweet. I believed him. I believed that if I worked hard enough, studied enough, I could choose my own path. The morning breeze rustled through the mango leaves above them, and Kamala was quiet for a moment before continuing. My father had died the year before, during the monsoon. He caught pneumonia, and we couldn't afford proper medical care. After his death, everything changed. Ma tried to hold our small farm together, but a woman alone, with 3 children, it was impossible. Priya felt a chill run through her as she began to understand where this story was leading. We were hungry most days, Kamala continued, her voice becoming flatter, more controlled. Ma would give us her portion of rice, claiming she had already eaten. She sold her wedding jewelry, piece by piece, but it was never enough. The moneylenders came every week, demanding payment on debts that kept growing no matter how much we gave them. What about your education? Couldn't Master Ji help somehow? Kamala's laugh was hollow. Education was a luxury we could no longer afford. Ma kept me in school as long as she could, but I could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes every day. She aged 10 years in the months after Papa's death, carrying burdens that no woman should have to bear alone. The story paused as Kamala seemed to gather strength for what came next. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a memory that had shaped every day of her life since. It was a Tuesday in March when Ma told me. I remember because it was the day we were supposed to start learning about fractions in mathematics class. I was excited about it. I loved the logic of numbers, how they could be broken down and rebuilt in different ways. Priya's hands clenched in her lap, dreading what was coming. I came home from school to find Ma sitting in our courtyard with 2 men I didn't recognize. Their clothes were better than ours, and one of them was counting out money, more money than I had seen in one place since Papa died. Ma's face was red from crying, but she smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that comes when someone is trying desperately to convince themselves they're doing the right thing. Kamala closed her eyes, and when she opened them, Priya saw tears threatening to spill over. Kamala, beta, Ma said. I have wonderful news. These gentlemen represent the Sharma family from the next village. They have a proposal for you. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe they wanted me to tutor their children or help with some household task. I was still thinking like a child who had choices. Oh, Nani, Priya breathed, her own eyes filling with tears. The older man, Ramon's uncle, I learned later, looked me up and down like he was evaluating a cow at market. He asked me to walk across the courtyard, to show my teeth, to confirm that I could read. Ma answered most of his questions for me, listing my domestic skills, my health, my character. I stood there like a piece of property being appraised, still not fully understanding what was happening. The morning sun had climbed higher, but the shade of the mango tree kept them cool. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang, marking the progression of time that had seemed to stop during Kamala's story. "When did you realize?" Priya asked quietly. When the man handed Ma an envelope thick with money and said, "The marriage can take place next month, before the hot season begins. Ramanji is eager to have a young wife to care for his household and children." Kamala's voice broke slightly. That's when I understood. I wasn't being hired to help. I was being sold to replace a dead woman I had never met. Priya reached for her grandmother's hand, feeling the calluses and prominent veins that spoke of decades of labor. "I ran," Kamala continued. "I dropped my school bag and ran toward the fields, as if I could somehow escape what had already been decided. Ma found me an hour later, hiding behind the old well where Papa used to tell me stories. She was crying harder than I was." "What did she say?" "She held me while we both sobbed. And then she tried to explain the impossible. She told me that the Sharma family would pay off all our debts and give us enough money to survive until my younger brother could work. She said that Raymond was a good man, a widower who needed a wife to care for his children and household. She promised me that I would be treated well, that I would have a secure home, that I wouldn't have to watch my family starve." Kamala was quiet for a long moment, staring at the patterns of light and shadow on the ground. "She wasn't lying about any of it," she said finally. "The Sharma family did pay our debts. Ma was able to keep our house, to send my brother to school eventually. And Raman, he wasn't cruel. But none of that changed the fact that my life as I had imagined it was ending before it had really begun." "How could your mother do that to you?" Priya asked, anger flashing in her voice. Kamala turned to study her granddaughter's face, seeing the privilege of someone who had never been hungry, never watched a parent sacrifice everything to keep their family alive. "Because she loved me," Kamala said simply. "Because in 1973 in our village, a 14-year-old girl from a poor family had only two futures, marriage or destitution. Ma chose the one that would keep me safe, even though it broke her heart to do it. But your dreams, your education, became luxuries we couldn't afford." Kamala's voice was matter-of-fact now, as if she was discussing the weather. "Masterji came to our house when he heard about the engagement. He pleaded with Ma to reconsider, offered to help find me a scholarship, promised that education would give me better opportunities than marriage. But what could he offer that was more immediate than the money sitting in Ma's hands? What could his promises of a better future mean to a woman watching her children grow thin from hunger?" The story hung between them like a weight too heavy for either to carry alone. Priya felt a new understanding of her grandmother beginning to form, but also a terrible recognition of the forces that had shaped not just Kamala's life, but the lives of countless women before her. "The next 3 weeks passed like a fever dream," Kamala continued. "Relatives arrived to help with wedding preparations that I watched like a spectator at my own funeral. Women measured me for blouses and saris, discussing my future as if I wasn't standing right there. Ma tried to prepare me for marriage with halting conversations about duties I couldn't understand, responsibilities that seemed to have nothing to do with the girl who had loved fractions and dreamed of teaching." "Were you angry?" "I was terrified," Kamala said honestly. "Anger came later, after I realized that terror wouldn't change anything. On my last day of school, Master G gave me a small Hindi poetry book. He wrote something inside the cover, but I was crying too hard to read it then. I still have that book." The morning was warming up, and other sounds of village life were beginning to intrude on their private sanctuary. But neither woman moved, both understanding that this conversation was too important to interrupt. The night before my wedding, Ma sat with me and tried to explain what my life would be like. She told me that Raman had 2 children from his first wife, that his mother lived with the family, that I would be expected to manage the household and eventually bear children of my own. She spoke about duty and adjustment, about how love could grow between two people even if they started as strangers. Did you believe her? I wanted to, Kamala said. But mostly I felt like I was disappearing. The girl who had loved learning, who had dreamed of standing in front of a classroom, she was fading away with each instruction about how to behave as a proper wife. By morning, I would be someone else entirely. She looked at Priya directly then, her eyes holding the accumulated wisdom and pain of 50 years. What I want you to understand, Beta, is that I wasn't just marrying a stranger. I was becoming a stranger to myself. And that… She paused, choosing her words carefully. That is something no young woman should ever have to do, no matter how practical or necessary it might seem to the adults who love her. The weight of her grandmother's story settled over Priya like a heavy shawl. She began to understand not just what Kamala had endured, but why she had remained silent about it for so long. Some experiences were too complex, too painful, too wrapped up in love and survival to be easily shared. But she also understood why her grandmother was sharing it now. Tomorrow, Kamala said, rising slowly from her place against the tree, I'll tell you about my wedding day, but first, I need you to promise me something. Anything, Nani. Promise me that whatever you decide about your own future, you'll make that decision as yourself, not as the person others think you should become. As they walked back toward the house, Priya felt as if she was seeing her grandmother for the first time. The quiet, traditional woman she had known all her life had been revealed as someone far more complex. A survivor, a woman who had found ways to preserve her essential self even when everything else was taken away. But she also felt the terrible weight of understanding. Her family's push toward arranged marriage wasn't just about tradition or security. It was about a cycle of women adapting to circumstances beyond their control, each generation hoping the next would find happiness within constraints they had learned to accept. For the first time since the marriage proposal had been announced, Priya began to understand that her choice would affect more than just her own future. It would determine whether this cycle continued or finally broke. The next morning found Kamala and Priya back beneath the mango tree, as if the grove had become their confessional, the only place where such truths could be safely spoken. Priya had barely slept, her mind churning with images of her 14-year-old grandmother facing an impossible future. When she looked at Kamala now, she saw layers she had never noticed before, the careful way her grandmother held herself, the practiced serenity that she now understood had been hard-won. Are you ready to hear the rest? Kamala asked gently, settling against the familiar trunk. Priya nodded, though she wasn't sure anyone could truly be ready for what was coming. Kamala closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they held the distant look of someone stepping back into a nightmare they had survived but never forgotten. My wedding day began before dawn, she said, her voice steady but hollow. The women of our family arrived early to begin the preparations, bathing me with turmeric paste, braiding my hair with flowers, painting my hands with henna that had been applied the night before. I felt like a doll being dressed for display. She paused, her fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on her sari. The red wedding sari was beautiful, silk that my mother had somehow managed to afford, with gold thread that caught the light. But when they draped it around me, it felt like a costume for someone else's life. I kept looking in the small mirror Ma held up, expecting to see myself, but finding a stranger staring back. A bride who looked like a child playing dress-up. Priya tried to imagine her grandmother as that terrified girl, but the image seemed impossible to reconcile with the strong woman beside her. The jewelry was the worst part, Kamala continued. Heavy gold necklaces, earrings that pulled at my lobes, bangles that clinked with every movement. Each piece felt like a shackle, marking me as someone's property. The nose ring. She touched her nostril reflexively. I had never worn one before. It hurt, and I kept crying, which made the kohl run down my cheeks. The women kept reapplying it, telling me to stop being silly, that every bride cries. But these weren't happy tears, Priya whispered. No, Kamala said simply. These were the tears of a girl watching her life end before it had truly begun. The morning breeze stirred the leaves above them, and Kamala seemed to draw strength from the familiar sound before continuing. The ceremony itself was a blur of Sanskrit mantras I didn't understand, rituals that felt ancient and foreign despite being part of my own culture. I remember the sacred fire, how hot it was on my face as we walked around it 7 times. Each circle was supposed to represent a vow, a promise I was making to a man I had barely looked at. What was Raman like? On that day, I mean. Kamala was quiet for a long moment, as if choosing her words carefully. He wasn't cruel, she said finally. That's what I remember most clearly. He could have been impatient with my tears, annoyed by my obvious terror. Instead, he was practical, distant, but not unkind. When I stumbled during one of the rituals, he steadied me without making a show of it. When the priest instructed him to place the Mongol sutra around my neck, his hands were gentle. She touched the thin gold chain she still wore, the one Priya had seen every day of her life without understanding its significance. But gentleness wasn't the same as warmth. When I finally looked at his face during the ceremony, I saw a man performing a necessary task. He was 44 years old, a widower with responsibilities. I was a solution to his problem, nothing more. There was no cruelty in that assessment, but there was no joy either. How did you feel? Numb, Kamala said without hesitation. Complete, overwhelming numbness. I went through the motions because that's what was expected, but inside I felt like I had died and was watching someone else's life unfold. The girl who had loved mathematics and dreamed of teaching was gone. In her place was this decorated stranger who belonged to a man she didn't know. Kamala paused to gather her thoughts, and Priya waited, understanding that these memories had been locked away for good reason. The worst moment came at the end, during the Vidai, when I had to leave my mother's house forever. Ma was crying so hard she could barely stand, and I realized that she understood exactly what she had done to me. She knew she had sacrificed my childhood to save our family, and the guilt was destroying her, even as the relief of our debts being paid gave her peace. What did you say to each other? She whispered that she was sorry, over and over. And I. Kamala's voice broke slightly. I told her I understood. Because I did understand, even through my terror. She had made the only choice available to her. That didn't make it hurt less, but it meant I couldn't hate her for it. The memory seemed to exhaust Kamala, and she sat quietly for several minutes before continuing. The journey to Raman's village took 3 hours by bullock cart. I sat in the back with some of his female relatives, listening to them discuss my new duties, like they were training a servant. They told me about Dadi, Raman's mother, and how particular she was about household management. They warned me about his children from his first marriage, how I shouldn't expect them to accept me immediately. They gave me advice about pleasing my new husband, suggestions that made my face burn with embarrassment and confusion. How old were his children? Raj was 8, and little Meena was only 5. Their mother had died, giving birth to a third child who didn't survive either. They had been without a mother for almost 2 years when I arrived, long enough to have learned to fend for themselves, but not long enough to have stopped hoping she might come back. Kamala's voice grew softer as she spoke about the children. When we reached Raman's house, they were waiting in the courtyard with Dadi. Raj stood very straight, trying to look like a man despite his young age. Meena hid behind her grandmother's sari, peeking out at me with huge, solemn eyes. I wanted to comfort them, to somehow explain that I wasn't trying to replace their mother, but the words wouldn't come. I was too overwhelmed by my own fear to address theirs. What was Dadi like? Kamala's expression darkened. Dadi was complicated. She had survived her own difficult marriage, raised her children through poverty and partition, lost her daughter-in-law and grandson. Life had made her hard, and she believed that hardness was strength. She looked at me that first day like she was evaluating whether I would be useful or merely another burden. Was she cruel to you? Not cruel, exactly. But she had very clear ideas about how a young wife should behave, and no patience for the adjustment period I needed. She expected me to know things I had never been taught, to manage responsibilities I had never imagined. When I made mistakes, and I made many, She corrected me with the sharp efficiency of someone who had no time for gentleness. Kamala shifted against the tree trunk, and Priya noticed how her grandmother's hands clenched unconsciously as she spoke about those early days. The house itself was larger than what I was used to, but somehow it felt smaller. Every room held reminders of the woman who had lived there before me, her sari still hanging in the cupboard, her cooking pots arranged in ways I didn't dare change, her children calling for Ma in the night and having to settle for a stranger's comfort. Did Raman's children accept you eventually? Slowly. Very slowly. Meena was easier. She was young enough to need mothering, and her loneliness eventually overcame her loyalty to her first mother's memory. But Raj... Kamala shook her head. Raj remembered his mother clearly, and he wasn't ready to let anyone take her place. He was polite, but distant. Helpful when asked, but never affectionate. I couldn't blame him. I was a reminder that his mother was truly gone, that his father had moved on to practical concerns like household management and future children. And Raman? How did he treat you in those early days? Kamala was quiet for a long time before answering, like a responsibility he had acquired. He was never unkind. He made sure I had enough to eat, that Deity didn't work me beyond my strength, that I had what I needed for my monthly cycles. But there was no warmth between us, no attempt at friendship or understanding. We were strangers sharing a house, bound together by legal and religious ceremonies but not by choice or affection. That must have been so lonely. Loneliness? Kamala repeated the word like it carried physical weight. Yes, that's exactly what it was. Complete, suffocating loneliness. I was surrounded by people all day. Daddy giving instructions, the children needing care, neighbors coming to visit. But I had never felt so alone in my life. I had no one to talk to about my fears, no one who understood what I was grieving. She paused, seeming to gather strength for what came next. The nights were the hardest. Raman was patient with my inexperience, but patient in the way someone might be with a nervous animal. There was no tenderness, no consideration for my feelings. I was his wife now, and certain duties came with that role. I learned to endure what I couldn't change, to find ways to disappear inside myself when disappearing physically wasn't possible. Priya felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she tried to imagine her grandmother's terror and isolation. But gradually, Kamala continued, her voice growing slightly stronger, I learned to navigate this new world. I figured out Dadi's preferences, learned to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. I discovered that Raj responded better to quiet encouragement than direct instruction, that Meena loved stories and would curl up next to me in the evenings if I told her tales about clever princesses and brave animals. You found ways to adapt. I found ways to survive, Kamala corrected gently. And survival, I learned, required a different kind of strength than I had ever imagined. Not the strength to fight or rebel, but the strength to bend without breaking, to find small spaces of joy within circumstances I couldn't change. She looked directly at Priya then, her eyes holding both the pain of those memories and the wisdom that had grown from them. I want you to understand something important, Beta. What I learned to do, that adaptation, that acceptance, it wasn't weakness. But it also wasn't the only choice available. I adapted because I had no other options. But you... She reached for Priya's hand. You have choices I could never have imagined. How do I know if I'm making the right choice? You ask yourself this. Will this decision allow you to remain yourself? Or will it require you to become someone else entirely? Because once you start disappearing into someone else's idea of who you should be, it's very difficult to find your way back to who you were meant to be. As they sat together in the dappled shade of the mango tree, Priya felt the weight of her grandmother's story settling into her bones. She was beginning to understand not just what Kamala had endured, but how that experience had shaped every decision she had made since, including her years of silence about the truth of her early marriage. But she was also beginning to understand something else. Her grandmother's decision to finally speak wasn't just about sharing the past, it was about changing the future. Tomorrow, Kamala said, rising slowly, I'll tell you how I learned to find myself again within that marriage. How love can grow in unexpected places. but also how important it is to know the difference between love that heals and adaptation that simply helps you survive. As they walked back toward the house, Priya carried with her not just the weight of her grandmother's suffering, but also the first glimmers of understanding about the strength that had carried Kamala through 5 decades of marriage to a man she had never chosen. The third morning found them returning to their sanctuary with an unspoken understanding that these conversations had become sacred, a daily ritual of truth-telling that was reshaping both their understandings of what it meant to be a woman in their family. Kamala moved more slowly today, as if revisiting these memories was taking a physical toll, but her resolve seemed stronger than ever. The changes didn't happen quickly. Kamala began without preamble, settling into her familiar spot against the mango tree. For the first year, I felt like I was drowning in someone else's life. But slowly, so slowly I barely noticed at first, I began to find small ways to breathe. Priya pulled her shawl closer against the morning chill and waited for her grandmother to continue. "It started with Raj's schoolwork," Kamala said, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. "He was struggling with his Hindi lessons, getting frustrated and angry when he couldn't form the letters properly. Daddy had no patience for his difficulties, and Raman was too busy with the fields to help. One evening, when Raj was near tears over his slate, I quietly sat beside him. You helped him. I showed him how I had learned to write, slowly, carefully, breaking each letter into simple strokes. I had kept my love of learning locked away for so long, afraid it would be seen as inappropriate for a wife to display such knowledge. But watching Raj struggle awakened something in me that I couldn't suppress." Kamala's voice grew warmer as she continued. "Raj was surprised that I could write so well. He had assumed, like everyone else, that I was just another village girl with basic literacy. When I helped him copy out a poem, he looked at my handwriting with something close to awe. 'It's beautiful, Ma,' he said, and then immediately looked stricken. It was the first time he had called me Ma instead of just addressing me by name. How did that feel? Like the first crack of sunlight through a window that had been shuttered for too long. I realized that in helping him, I had found a way to use the education I thought I had lost forever. More than that, I had finally connected with this child who had been so careful to keep me at a distance." Kamala paused to watch a peacock strut across the far end of the grove, its tail feathers catching the morning light. Word spread quickly in our small household. When Meena saw me helping Raj, she brought her own slate with pictures she had drawn, crooked houses and stick-figure families. I began teaching her to write her name, and then simple words. She would sit pressed against my side during these lessons, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving my mother's house. The pure joy of being needed for something other than cooking and cleaning. Did Daddy approve? Kamala's expression grew complicated. Daddy was pragmatic. She had no education herself, and she had watched her grandchildren struggle with their lessons. When she saw their improvement, when their teacher began sending home notes praising their progress, she grudgingly acknowledged that my help was useful. But she made it clear that household duties came first. Teaching could only happen after all other work was complete. And Raman? What did he think? That's where things began to shift in ways I hadn't expected, Kamala said thoughtfully. One evening, about 18 months after our marriage, Raman came home to find me helping both children with their lessons. Raj was reading aloud from his Hindi primer, while Meena practiced writing the alphabet. I froze when I saw him, afraid he would disapprove of his wife acting like a teacher. Priya leaned forward, sensing this was a pivotal moment in her grandmother's story. Instead, he sat down and listened. When Raj stumbled over a difficult word, I guided him through it, breaking it into syllables the way Masterji had taught me. Raman watched this interaction with an expression I couldn't read. After the children went to bed, I expected a lecture about overstepping my boundaries. What happened instead? He asked me where I had learned to teach so well. It was the first real conversation we had ever had. Not instructions about household management or polite inquiries about my health, but genuine curiosity about who I was as a person. Kamala's voice softened with the memory. I told him about Masterji, about my dreams of becoming a teacher, about the books I had loved. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said something that changed everything between us. What did he say? He said, "I didn't know I had married someone so intelligent. Perhaps I should have asked more questions before the wedding." Kamala laughed softly. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was an acknowledgement that he had seen me as a solution to his problems, rather than as a person with her own capabilities and dreams. That must have felt incredible. It felt dangerous, Kamala said honestly. For so long, I had protected myself by being invisible, by meeting expectations, without revealing too much of who I really was. Suddenly, he was asking questions, showing interest in my thoughts and opinions. Part of me wanted to retreat back into safety, but another part, the part that had been starving for intellectual connection, couldn't resist the opportunity to finally be seen. Kamala shifted against the tree, her expression growing more animated as she described this turning point. The changes accelerated after that conversation. Raymond began asking for my opinion on decisions about the children's education. When the village got a new teacher who was stricter than Master G, and Raj came home with complaints, Raman and I discussed together how to help him adjust. When Meena showed artistic talent, I was the one who suggested we find her better drawing materials. You became partners in raising the children. In raising the children, yes, but also in other ways I hadn't expected. Raman started bringing me problems from the farm. Questions about crop rotation, concerns about village politics, decisions about household expenses. He would lay out the facts and ask what I thought, treating my opinions as valuable rather than dismissing them as inappropriate for a woman to hold. Priya tried to imagine this evolution in her grandparents' relationship, the slow building of respect and partnership from such an unpromising beginning. But the real transformation came when I became pregnant with my first child, Kamala continued, her hand unconsciously moving to her abdomen. I was terrified, of course. I was barely 16, still feeling like a child myself. But Raman... She paused, searching for the right words. He became protective in a way that felt different from duty. How so? He started paying attention to things like whether I was getting enough rest, whether Daddy was working me too hard, whether I had everything I needed. But more than that, he began talking to me about the future, not just practical matters, but hopes and dreams for our growing family. He would sit with me in the evenings and ask about my day, really listen to my answers, share his own worries and plans. Kamala's voice grew soft with remembered wonder. One night, when I was about 6 months pregnant, I woke up feeling unwell. Raman found me sitting outside, trying to settle my stomach in the cool air. Instead of just checking that I was all right and going back to bed, he sat with me. We talked for hours, about his first wife, about the children he had lost, about his fears of losing another family. And I talked about my mother, about the dreams I had given up, about how strange it felt to be carrying a child when I still felt like a child myself. It sounds like you were finally getting to know each other as people. Exactly. For the first time since our wedding, we weren't just fulfilling roles, husband and wife, father and stepmother. We were two people who happened to be sharing a life, and we were discovering that we actually liked and respected each other as individuals. Kamala was quiet for a moment, lost in the memory of that gradual awakening. The night our first child was born, your father, I understood something about love that I had never imagined before. Not just the overwhelming rush of maternal feeling, but the way Raman looked at me as I held our son. There was gratitude there, yes, but also something deeper. Pride. Tenderness. The recognition that we had created something beautiful together, despite the circumstances that had brought us together. You fell in love with him. I grew into love with him, Kamala corrected gently. It wasn't the passionate, overwhelming feeling that poets write about. It was something quieter but perhaps more durable, a love built on shared experience, mutual respect, and the gradual recognition that we made each other better people than we were alone. Priya felt a complex mix of emotions as she listened to this part of her grandmother's story. There was relief that Kamala had found happiness, but also a troubling question about what it all meant. But Nani, she said carefully, doesn't this prove that arranged marriages can work? That love can grow even when people don't choose each other? Kamala studied her granddaughter's face for a long moment before answering. It proves that humans are remarkably adaptable, Beta. That we can find ways to build meaningful lives even within circumstances we wouldn't have chosen. But, she held up a warning finger, it doesn't prove that adaptation is the same as fulfillment, or that finding love within constraints means those constraints were justified. I don't understand the difference. The difference is agency, Kamala said firmly. I learned to love Rahman, yes. We built a good marriage and raised 6 children together. But I also spent the rest of my life wondering who I might have become if I had been allowed to choose my own path. The teacher I might have been, the books I might have written, the ways I might have contributed to our community if my education hadn't been cut short. Kamala's voice grew stronger, more urgent. The love I found with Rahman was real and precious. But it was love that grew in spite of how we came together, not because of it. And the price I paid, my lost education, my abandoned dreams, the years of loneliness before understanding developed, that price was too high, even for the happiness I eventually found. So you're saying arranged marriage is wrong? I'm saying that forcing anyone, man or woman, into marriage before they're ready, without their full consent and participation in the choice, is wrong. Some arranged marriages work out well, many don't. But the success or failure isn't the point. The point is that every person deserves the right to choose their own path to love and partnership. Kamala reached for Priya's hands, holding them firmly. What I want you to understand is that my story isn't an argument for accepting what others decide is best for you. It's proof that you can survive almost anything. But survival isn't the same as thriving. You have the opportunity to choose love freely, to build a partnership based on mutual choice and respect from the very beginning. Don't throw that away, because my generation learned to make the best of situations we couldn't control. As they sat together in the growing warmth of the morning, Priya felt the weight of her grandmother's wisdom settling around her like a protective cloak. She was beginning to understand that Kamala's story wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, and the choices that each generation made for the next. Tomorrow, Kamala said, rising with careful dignity, I'll tell you about the hardest decision I ever had to make as a mother, about the moment I had to choose between tradition and my children's futures, and how that choice shaped the woman you've become today. Walking back toward the house, Priya carried with her a new understanding of love's complexity, how it could grow in unexpected places, but also how much more beautiful it might be when chosen freely from the very beginning. The 4th morning arrived with unseasonable clouds gathering on the horizon, threatening rain that would break the dry spell but also confine them indoors. Kamala looked up at the darkening sky with something approaching relief, as if the weather matched the weight of what she needed to share today. We should walk quickly to our place, she told Priya, moving with more urgency than she had shown in previous days. This story needs to be told under open sky. They settled beneath the mango tree, just as the first fat drops began to fall, creating a gentle patter on the leaves above them. Kamala pulled her sari closer and seemed to draw strength from the approaching storm. By the time I was 30, she began, I had 6 children and had found a way to balance the woman I had become with the girl I had once been. Rahman and I had built something real together, not the fairy tale romance I had once read about in books, but a partnership based on respect, shared responsibility, and genuine affection. Priya noticed how her grandmother's posture changed when she spoke about these middle years, straighter, more confident, as if remembering a time when she had felt more in control of her life. I had even found ways to continue learning. While teaching our children, I had essentially educated myself through their textbooks. I could help with mathematics through 8th standard, guide them through Hindi and English literature, even assist with basic science. Rahman began consulting me not just about household matters, but about village issues, farming decisions, even political discussions. I had carved out a space where my intelligence was valued and used. It sounds like you had found happiness. I had found purpose, Kamala corrected, which is perhaps more important than happiness. I felt useful, respected, needed for more than just domestic labor. But her expression darkened. That sense of security was about to be tested in ways I never anticipated. The rain began falling more steadily, creating a protective curtain around their conversation. Kamala's voice dropped, as if what she was about to share required the utmost privacy. In 1995, when Anjali was 15, the same age I had been when I gave birth to her, Our family faced a crisis that brought all my old fears rushing back. There had been 3 years of poor monsoons, crops failing, debts mounting. The small prosperity we had built was crumbling, and we found ourselves in a situation eerily similar to the one my mother had faced 22 years earlier. Priya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Raman's older brother arrived one evening with what he presented as a solution. His friend's son, a man in his 30s with a good government job, was looking for a wife. He had seen Anjali at a wedding and been impressed by her beauty and demeanor. The family was prepared to pay a substantial sum for the marriage alliance, enough to clear our debts and provide security for the rest of our children. "Oh no," Priya whispered, understanding immediately where this was leading. Anjalep was in her final year of school, dreaming of becoming a teacher like I had once hoped to be. She was bright, ambitious, and for the first time in our family's history, we had been planning to send a daughter to college. But suddenly, all those plans seemed like luxuries we couldn't afford. Kamala's hands clenched in her lap as she continued. The family meeting was almost identical to the one my mother had endured. Men counting out money, discussing Anjali's qualities like she was merchandise, making practical arguments about security and stability. And there I sat, listening to the same justifications that had shaped my entire life, feeling the terrible weight of history repeating itself. What did Raman think? At first, he supported the proposal. The financial pressure was enormous, and he saw it as a practical solution to our problems. The boy is educated, well-employed, from a good family, he argued. Anjali would be well cared for, and we could afford to continue the other children's education. The logic was exactly the same as what my mother had used to justify my marriage. Kamala paused as a particularly heavy gust of wind sent rain spattering around them. She seemed to be gathering courage for what came next. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I found myself standing outside Anjali's room listening to her cry. The sound transported me back 22 years to my own tears, my own desperate prayers for some other solution. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. What? I realized that I had become my mother. Despite everything I had learned, all the ways I had grown and found my voice within my marriage, I was about to make the same impossible choice that had been made for me. I was about to sacrifice my daughter's dreams for the family's survival. Kamala's voice broke slightly, and Priya saw tears mixing with the raindrops on her grandmother's cheeks. I went into her room and sat on her bed, just as my mother had done with me. Anjali threw herself into my arms and begged me not to let them marry her to a stranger. "Ma," she said, "I want to be a teacher. I want to choose my own husband when I'm ready. Please don't let them do to me what was done to you." "She knew about your marriage?" "Children see more than we think they do." She had always sensed that my marriage had been different from the love matches she read about in books, had noticed how I never spoke about falling in love with her father, how I sometimes grew sad when discussing marriage arrangements for other girls in the village. The rain was falling harder now, but neither woman suggested seeking shelter. This conversation felt too important to interrupt. Holding my daughter while she pleaded for her freedom, I felt something break open inside me. All the years of adaptation, of finding ways to be content within circumstances I hadn't chosen, of telling myself that love could grow from duty, all of it crumbled in the face of her tears. "What did you do?" "I made a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I told her that I would find another way, that she would not be married against her will, that her education would continue. But making that promise meant I had to find the courage to stand up to my husband, his family, and generations of tradition." Kamala's voice grew stronger as she described the confrontation that followed. The next morning, I asked Raman to walk with me to these very mango trees. I told him that we could not and would not arrange Anjali's marriage. When he started to argue about our financial situation, I interrupted him, something I had never done before in 22 years of marriage. "What did you say?" I told him about my wedding day. Not the sanitized version I had shared with the children, but the truth. The terror, the grief, the years of loneliness before love developed. I told him about the dreams I had abandoned, the woman I might have become, the price I had paid for a security I never chose. Priya held her breath, waiting to hear how her grandfather had responded. Raman was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he asked me something that showed how much he had grown as a person. If you could do it again, knowing what our life together became, would you still choose differently? And I answered honestly, I'm grateful for the love we found, but yes, I would choose my own path, even if it meant we never met. How did he take that? It hurt him at first, but then I saw understanding dawn in his eyes. He realized that his appreciation for our marriage had blinded him to the cost it had required from me. More importantly, he understood that requiring that same cost from our daughter would be a betrayal of everything we had learned about respect and partnership. Kamala smiled then, the first genuine smile Priya had seen from her during these difficult conversations. That evening, Rahman called his brother and declined the marriage proposal. When his brother argued about the practical benefits, Rahman said something that made me fall in love with him all over again. My daughter's education and freedom are not for sale. We'll find another way to solve our problems. But how did you manage financially? It wasn't easy. We sold some land, took out loans against future harvests, and I began tutoring other children in the village for small fees. Rahman took on additional work during the off-season. The entire family made sacrifices to keep Anjali in school, but they were sacrifices we chose rather than ones forced upon us. And Anjali? Anjali finished school, went to teacher training college, and eventually chose her own husband, your father, when she was 24 and ready for marriage. She built the career I had once dreamed of, and she made her own choice about when and whom to marry. Kamala's expression grew thoughtful as she continued, but the most important thing that happened was that our family's understanding of marriage and choice began to evolve. The other children watched their sister pursue her education and choose her own path. They learned that individual dreams and family loyalty didn't have to be in opposition to each other. Did you ever regret the decision? Never. Not even during the hardest financial times that followed. Because I had learned something crucial. Breaking cycles of harm is more important than maintaining traditions that cause suffering. My mother had done what she thought was best for me with the limited options available to her. But I had the opportunity to give my daughter something different, the chance to choose her own future. The rain had begun to lighten, creating a misty atmosphere around them that felt almost sacred. Kamala reached for Priya's hand, her grip firm despite her age. What I want you to understand, Beta, is that the decision about your marriage isn't just about you. It's about what kind of future we're creating for the daughters who come after you. Every time a woman accepts an arrangement she doesn't want, it reinforces the idea that women's choices are less important than family convenience. Every time a woman stands up for her right to choose, it makes it easier for the next woman to do the same. But what if my choice disappoints the family? What if it causes conflict? Some conflicts are worth having, Kamala said firmly. The conflict over my decision to protect Anjali's freedom was difficult, but it led to important conversations about what we truly valued as a family. In the end, most people came to respect our choice, even if they didn't initially understand it. As they prepared to return to the house, Kamala paused and looked directly at her granddaughter. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about something I've never shared with anyone, not even your mother. About the choice you're facing now, and why I believe your generation has the power to change things in ways mine never could. Walking back through the gentle rain, Priya felt the weight of her grandmother's story settling into her understanding of herself and her place in the family's history. She was beginning to see that her decision about marriage wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger story about women's freedom, family evolution, and the courage required to choose love over fear. The cycle that had trapped her grandmother was finally within reach of being broken. The question was whether Priya would have the courage to be the one to break it. The fifth morning brought clear skies and the fresh smell of earth after rain. As they walked to their familiar sanctuary, Priya's steps felt heavier than usual. She had spent the night wrestling with everything her grandmother had shared, and she knew the time for her own honesty had arrived. "Nani," she said quietly as they settled beneath the mango tree, "before you tell me anything more, I need to tell you something." Kamala studied her granddaughter's face, noting the nervous energy that radiated from her like heat from a fever. "What is it, Beta?" "I'm not just afraid of marrying Dr. Vikram because he's a stranger," Priya began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid because I'm already in love with someone else." The words hung between them like a confession in a temple, sacred and terrifying. Kamala felt her breath catch, not from shock, but from recognition. She saw in Priya's face the same mixture of hope and terror she had once carried about her own secret dreams. "Tell me about him," Kamala said simply. The permission in those 4 words seemed to unlock something in Priya. "His name is Arjun Mishra. We met at college during our final year. He's studying engineering, computer engineering, like me, but with a focus on rural development projects." "What kind of man is he?" Priya's face lit up in a way Kamala had never seen before. "He's kind, Nani. Really kind. Not just polite, but genuinely caring about other people. He tutors younger students who can't afford coaching classes. He sends half his scholarship money home to his family. And he listens. Really listens. When I talk about my dreams for my career." Kamala felt a bittersweet ache watching her granddaughter describe love the way it should be, freely chosen, based on mutual respect and genuine affection. "But his family," Priya's expression clouded. "His father owns a small electronics shop. They're respectable people, but not wealthy. Not the kind of match our family would consider suitable." "And you love him despite this? Or because of who he is?" "Because of who he is," Priya said without hesitation. "He makes me laugh, Nani. He challenges me to think bigger about what I can accomplish." When I told him about my dreams of working with technology in rural areas, he didn't dismiss them or suggest I should focus on marriage instead. He asked how we could work together to make those dreams reality. Kamala felt tears threatening as she recognized the partnership her granddaughter described, the kind of mutual support and respect she had eventually found with Raman, but which Priya had discovered freely. "How long have you known him?" 2 years. We've been close friends for most of that time, but only admitted our feelings 6 months ago. We've been careful, meeting only at college or in group settings." "But Nani," Priya's voice broke slightly, "I can't imagine marrying anyone else. The thought of giving up what we have for an arrangement with Dr. Vikram feels like killing something beautiful before it has a chance to bloom." "Does he know about your family's expectations?" "Yes. And he's offered to approach your family properly, to ask for permission to court me. But I'm terrified they'll reject him because of his background, or be angry that I've hidden this relationship." Kamala was quiet for a long moment, processing not just her granddaughter's words but the courage it had taken to speak them. "Beta," she said finally, "love freely chosen is one of life's greatest gifts. Don't let fear steal that from you." The secret lasted 3 more days. Priya had returned from her morning conversation with Kamala with a new lightness in her step, a confidence that hadn't been there since the marriage proposal was announced. She moved through her household duties with the distracted air of someone whose mind was elsewhere, humming softly under her breath and occasionally smiling at private thoughts. It was this very happiness that betrayed her. Anjali noticed first, the way her daughter's phone buzzed with messages that made her blush, the careful way Priya angled the screen away from curious eyes, the sudden interest in wearing her better saris, even for ordinary days at home. A mother's intuition, sharpened by years of teaching adolescents, recognized the signs of a secret romance. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening, as the family gathered for dinner. Priya's phone rang just as they were sitting down to eat, and without thinking, she answered it with a softness in her voice that made everyone at the table look up. "Han, I'll call you back later," she said quietly, but not quietly enough to hide the tenderness in her tone. "Who was that?" Anjali asked casually, but her eyes were sharp with suspicion. "Just a friend from college," Priya replied, but her face flushed in a way that made the lie obvious. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Raman's older brother, who had been visiting to discuss the arrangements with Dr. Vikram's family, set down his glass of water with deliberate emphasis. "Priya," he said in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "show me your phone." "What?" Priya's hand instinctively moved to protect the device. "Your phone. If it was just a college friend, you won't mind showing us." Kamala felt her heart begin to race. Across the courtyard, she could see the trap closing around her granddaughter, the same inexorable march toward revelation and judgment that had characterized her own life so many decades ago. "That's not necessary," Anjali said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Priya, just tell us who called." The moment stretched like a wire being pulled taut. Priya looked around the table at the faces of her family, some curious, some stern, all waiting for an explanation that would change everything. "His name is Arjun," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He's someone I care about." The explosion of voices that followed made Kamala flinch. Raman's brother's voice rose above the others. "Care about? What does that mean? Have you been meeting boys without your family's knowledge?" "It's not like that," Priya said desperately. "We met at college. We're friends." "Friends don't call each other with that tone of voice," Anjali interrupted, her teacher's instincts cutting straight to the truth. "Priya, tell us exactly what this relationship is." Kamala watched her granddaughter's face cycle through panic, determination, and finally a kind of desperate courage. When Priya spoke again, her voice was stronger. "I love him," she said simply, "and he loves me. We've been hoping to approach the family properly, to ask for your permission to marry." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the storm broke. "How dare you?" Raman's brother slammed his hand on the table. "How dare you carry on with some boy while we're arranging your marriage to a respectable family? Do you have any idea what this does to our reputation?" "What family is this boy from?" Priya's father asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "His name is Arjun Mishra. His father owns an electronics shop in the city. He's a good man, Papa. He's a shopkeeper's son?" The disdain in her uncle's voice was palpable. "You would throw away a marriage to a doctor for a shopkeeper's son?" "I would choose love over arrangement," Priya shot back, her own voice rising now. "I would choose someone who respects me and shares my dreams over someone who sees me as a convenient wife." "Dreams?" Her uncle laughed bitterly. "What dreams? You're 22 years old, educated, from a good family. Your dream should be marriage and children, not this romantic nonsense." Kamala felt the familiar weight of generational conflict settling over the courtyard like a heavy blanket. She watched as her family divided along predictable lines. The older relatives shocked and disapproving, the younger cousins looking sympathetic but afraid to speak, Anjali caught between supporting her daughter and maintaining family harmony. "This is what comes of too much education," her uncle continued. "Girls get ideas beyond their station, start thinking they can choose their own husbands like they're shopping for vegetables." "Enough," Raman said quietly, but his voice carried an authority that silenced the table. He looked at his daughter with an expression Kamala couldn't read. "Priya, how long has this been going on?" 2 years, Papa. But we've been careful, respectful. We've never—" 2 years? Anjali's voice cracked. "You've been lying to us for 2 years?" "I wasn't lying. I knew you wouldn't understand." "Because we care about your future more than some temporary infatuation?" "Because you care more about family reputation than my happiness." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Kamala saw the hurt flash across Anjali's face, followed by anger. "How ungrateful can you be?" Anjali said, her voice shaking. "We've given you everything: education, freedom, respect. And this is how you repay us? By sneaking around with some unsuitable boy?" "He's not unsuitable. He's kind and intelligent and hardworking. He treats me as an equal partner, not as someone whose only value is in serving his family." "And what does this paragon know about our family?" Raman's brother asked sarcastically. "What does he know about duty, responsibility, tradition?" "He knows that tradition should honor people, not trap them," Priya replied, and Kamala felt a surge of pride at her granddaughter's courage. But courage, Kamala knew, was not always enough to overcome the weight of family expectations. "This discussion is over," her uncle declared. "The arrangement with Dr. Vikram's family proceeds as planned. This infatuation, ends now. No, Priya said, standing up from the table. I won't marry Dr. Vikram. I won't marry anyone. I don't choose. The finality in her voice seemed to galvanize the family. Voices rose again, arguments flying across the table about duty and disgrace, about what would happen to the family's reputation if word of this got out. Kamala sat in her corner, watching the scene unfold with the terrible clarity of someone who had lived through this exact moment 50 years earlier. She saw her granddaughter standing alone against the weight of family tradition, and she remembered her own younger self, crying and pleading with no one to support her choice. But this time was different. This time, there was someone who understood what was at stake. Stop, Kamala said quietly. The word cut through the arguments, like a knife through cloth. Every head turned toward her, surprised by the intervention from someone who usually remained silent during family conflicts. Stop, she repeated, rising slowly from her place. All of you. She walked to where Priya stood, her granddaughter's face wet with tears, but her spine still straight with defiance. Kamala placed a protective hand on Priya's shoulder and faced the family that had shaped her life for 7 decades. I have something to say, she announced, her voice carrying an authority none of them had heard before. And all of you are going to listen. The courtyard fell silent, waiting for the words that would change everything. 50 years ago, I stood where Priya stands now, Kamala began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. 50 years ago, I begged my family not to force me into marriage with a stranger. And no one listened. No one stood up for my right to choose my own future. She looked around the table at the shocked faces of her family. Today, I stand with my granddaughter. Today, someone speaks for the girl who has no voice in her own future. Priya will not be forced into marriage. She will not be punished for choosing love over arrangement. And if this family cannot accept that, then this family has learned nothing from the pain of the past. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of revelation and change. For the first time in her life, Kamala had found her voice at the moment when it mattered most. The battle for Priya's future had truly begun. The silence that followed Kamala's declaration stretched like a taut wire, threatening to snap under the weight of generations of unspoken truths. The family sat frozen around the dinner table, their faces reflecting shock, confusion, and in some cases, a dawning understanding of what this meant. Raman's brother was the first to recover his voice. Maji, with all respect, this is not your decision to make. The girl's marriage arrangements are the responsibility of her parents, not her grandmother. And whose responsibility was my marriage? Kamala asked quietly, her hand still firm on Priya's shoulder. Who spoke for me when I was 14 and terrified? Who asked what I wanted, what I dreamed of becoming? That was different, he replied, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Times were harder then. Families had fewer choices. Times are always hard for those without power, Kamala said. And young women have always been those without power, until someone decides that has to change. Anjali looked between her mother and daughter, her face a portrait of internal conflict. Ma, you never told us about your marriage, I mean. We thought… You thought what? That I was happy to be married at 14? That I gladly gave up my education, my dreams of teaching, to become a stranger's wife? Kamala's voice carried decades of suppressed pain. I let you think that because I wanted to protect you from the weight of my experience. But silence, I've learned, is not protection. It's perpetuation. Priya's father spoke for the first time since the revelation began. Ma, I don't understand. You and Papa were happy. You built a good life together. We built a good life despite how it began, not because of it, Kamala corrected gently. Your father and I learned to love each other, yes. But that love grew from years of patient understanding, from slowly discovering each other as people rather than roles. It was love that survived an arranged marriage, not love that justified it. She looked around the table, meeting each family member's eyes in turn. What I want you to understand is that love shouldn't have to survive such a beginning. It should be allowed to grow freely, naturally, between two people who choose each other willingly. The sound of motorcycles approaching interrupted the heavy conversation. Through the courtyard gate came Drive. Vikram himself, accompanied by his parents and what appeared to be several other family members. They had come, clearly, for a formal discussion about wedding arrangements. The timing couldn't have been worse. Or perhaps, Kamala thought, it was exactly what was needed to force a final resolution. Anjali rose hastily, smoothing her sari and attempting to compose herself. Dr. Vikram. Auntie Ji, Uncle Ji. We weren't expecting you this evening. We thought it would be good to meet the family more informally, Dr. Vikram's mother said warmly, then paused as she took in the tension around the dinner table. Are we interrupting something? The moment of truth had arrived. Kamala felt Priya trembling under her hand, and she tightened her grip in support. Actually, Dr. Vikram said, his voice gentle but observant, it seems like there might be some family discussion happening. We can certainly come back another time. He was, Kamala noted, more perceptive than many men his age. His eyes had immediately gone to Priya's tear-stained face, and his expression showed concern rather than annoyance at the obvious distress. No, please sit, Raman said heavily. Perhaps this conversation needs to happen with everyone present. As the Mehta family settled themselves in the courtyard, accepting the hastily offered tea and sweets, Kamala made a decision that surprised even herself. Dr. Vikram, she said, addressing him directly. Before any arrangements are discussed further, there's something you should know. My granddaughter is in love with someone else. The gasps from both families were audible, but Kamala continued steadily. She has been in a relationship with a young man from her college for 2 years. They wish to marry each other. I believe you deserve to know this before you make any commitments to a girl whose heart belongs elsewhere. Dr. Vikram's response surprised everyone. Instead of anger or indignation, he looked thoughtful, even relieved. I appreciate your honesty, he said quietly. And I have a confession of my own. He looked around at the gathered families. I have been reluctant about this arrangement myself. There is someone I care about deeply but whom my family considers unsuitable due to her background. His mother's sharp intake of breath indicated this was news to her, but Dr. Vikram continued. I agreed to meet Priya because I thought perhaps duty would be easier than fighting for love. But, seeing her distress tonight, understanding that we would both be entering this marriage with our hearts elsewhere. He shook his head. That's not fair to either of us. But Beta, his mother protested, the girl you're speaking of, is a nurse from a middle-class family, he said firmly. She's intelligent, compassionate, and dedicated to helping others. She makes me a better man. Isn't that what matters in a life partner? Kamala felt a smile tugging at her lips. Sometimes, she thought, the universe conspired to prove that change was possible. So you're both saying you want to marry other people? Raman asked, as if trying to confirm he had understood correctly. Yes, Papa, Priya said, her voice stronger now. I want to marry Arjun. I want to choose love freely, the way Nani never could. Dr. Vikram nodded, and I would like to ask both families to consider that perhaps we're all trying too hard to arrange happiness, instead of allowing it to find its own way. The conversation that followed was unlike anything their traditional family had ever experienced. For the first time, young voices were given equal weight with older ones. Concerns about social status were balanced against questions about genuine compatibility. Financial security was discussed alongside emotional fulfillment. Dr. Vikram's parents, initially shocked by their son's revelation, gradually began to soften as he described the woman he loved. Similarly, as Priya spoke about Arjun, his character, his ambitions, his respect for her dreams, even her uncle's objections began to lose their force. Perhaps, Dr. Vikram's father said thoughtfully, we should meet these young people our children have chosen. Judge them on their merits rather than their family backgrounds. And perhaps, Anjali added, looking at her mother with new understanding, we should consider that our children might know their own hearts better than we know them for them. As the evening progressed, what had begun as a confrontation slowly transformed into something unprecedented. A family discussion where everyone's voice mattered, where tradition was questioned rather than blindly followed, where love was considered as important as duty. It wasn't easy. There were arguments, hurt feelings, and moments when old patterns of thinking reasserted themselves. But gradually, patiently, a new understanding began to emerge. When Arjun arrived the next day to formally meet Priya's family, he came not as a supplicant begging for permission, but as a young man confident in his worth and his love. Kamala watched as he answered their questions with honesty and respect, spoke about his plans for the future, and, most importantly, deferred to Priya as an equal partner in their shared dreams. "He reminds me of your grandfather," Kamala told Priya later. "Not as he was when we married, but as he became once. He learned to see me as a person rather than a role." 3 weeks later, Dr. Vikram brought his beloved Kavita to meet both families. The woman was everything he had described: intelligent, compassionate, and clearly devoted to him. More importantly, their obvious joy in each other's company provided a stark contrast to what an arranged marriage between reluctant partners would have looked like. The transformations weren't limited to the younger generation. Anjali began to speak more openly about her own struggles, balancing tradition with personal fulfillment. Ramon started asking his wife's opinions on matters he had previously decided alone. Even the extended family began to reconsider their assumptions about marriage, choice, and what constituted a successful family. But perhaps the most significant change was in Kamala herself. For the first time in 50 years, she felt truly at peace with her past. By breaking her silence, by using her story to protect her granddaughter's future, she had finally found a way to honor both the woman she had been forced to become and the girl whose dreams had been sacrificed. "Nani," Priya said one evening as they sat together in the courtyard, "thank you for finding your voice when I needed it most." "Thank you," Kamala replied, "for having the courage I never had. For showing this family that love chosen freely is worth fighting for." As the sun set over their village, grandmother and granddaughter sat in comfortable silence, both understanding that they had not just resolved a family crisis, they had changed the trajectory of generations to come. 6 months later, the village had never seen a wedding quite like Priya and Arjun's. The ceremony itself honored every tradition: the sacred fire, the Sanskrit mantras, the 7 circles that bound their lives together. But there was something different in the air, a sense of joy and authenticity that came from witnessing 2 people who had chosen each other freely, completely, without reservation. Kamala sat in the place of honor reserved for the eldest family matriarch, watching her granddaughter's face glow with happiness. Priya wore the same red silk sari that Kamala had worn 50 years earlier, but transformed. Where Kamala's wedding photos showed a terrified child, Priya radiated confidence and joy. "She looks like she belongs in her own life," Anjali whispered to her mother, unconsciously echoing Kamala's own thoughts. Across the wedding pavilion, Dr. Vikram sat with Kavita, their own engagement having been announced the week before. The sight of them together, comfortable, laughing, clearly in love, served as a quiet testament to the changes their families had embraced. But it was when the pundit asked for the blessing of the eldest woman present that the true significance of this day became clear. Kamala rose slowly, her voice carrying across the assembled families. "I bless this union between 2 hearts that chose each other freely. May their love grow stronger with each passing year, and may their children know from birth that they are valued for who they are, not who others wish them to become." As Priya and Arjun completed their vows, Kamala felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle that had trapped her at 14 was finally, truly broken. Her granddaughter would begin her married life as herself, educated, confident, deeply loved and loving in return. The girl who had once dreamed of teaching had finally changed the world, 1 generation at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,